My name is Patty Bernard, and I'm a member of the Nevada Women's History Project. Today is Wednesday, September 17th, 2025, and we are in Reno, Nevada, interviewing Karen Gedney, who was the Nevada State Prison's first woman doctor. This interview is being funded generously by the Estelle J. Kelsey Foundation. Welcome, Karen, and thank you so much for interviewing with us.
And thank you, Patty, for giving me the opportunity to share my unusual life.
Karen, can you start our interview by just telling a little bit about your formative years, your parents, where you grew up?
I certainly can tell about my early years in life. I grew up in the Catskill Mountains in New York. My mother was a German immigrant that survived the Second World War. My father was the product of a Dutch sea captain and an illegitimate German countess, but he ended up in the United States and he had a sort of miserable upbringing. Neither of my parents ever finished high school. And when I was born, I still remember my mother telling me later in life that they wanted to name me Karina, but this is the 50s, a little too close to the Second World War, and Germany was still a problem. And they changed my name to Karen on the hospital certificate, telling my mother too German. And I would say my family was very much German growing up. My parents spoke German, but they didn't want my sister and I'm the oldest, one sister younger. They didn't want us to speak German, but I understand German. Und meine Aussprache auf Deutsch ist sehr schrecklich, which means I have a horrible German accent because I never really spoke. But the thing growing up is I grew up in a beautiful place where my father was really into skiing, hiking, physical activity, and my sister and I have always been, let's say, in the sports world. Title IX came about when we were literally in junior high, and we were the first females that were allowed to play interscholastic sports. And so my sister and I were volleyball, basketball. She went softball, and then I went track. But we played all the sports. And one of the biggest things with my parents is they were based on resilience, always saving money, always never asking for help. That was a big one. Never bother people, never ask for anything. And my father made the point when I told him in fourth grade that I wanted to be a doctor. And he said, "That's nice." He patted me on the head and said, "But at 18, you're out of the house." So from 18 on, everything was up to me to figure out how to go to college, medical school, and everything else.
You didn't mention your parents' names, so what are their names, and how about your schooling?
Well, my mother's name was Eva Maria Charlotte Krinka, okay, and my father's real name was Karl Heinz Jonker, but when his original father died, his mother didn't have money, and his mother, Erika Stichhorst, ended up marrying a rich guy, and that guy said, this is a weird name, we're changing it to Alfred Gedney. This is how I ended up with an English name that has nothing to do with me, Gedney. So, both my parents are, deceased for quite a while.
Did you like school?
I loved school because, one, I have this curiosity gene where I love to learn things, and I didn't realize it, but in retrospect, I was horribly, horribly nearsighted, and the only thing I could see was books close to me, right? And I hid the fact from my parents for a long time that I couldn't see, because as a kid, you don't realize that's normal to be able to see here and nothing in the distance. But eventually they figured out, wow, this kid's really blind. And I would always lie in school when they make you look at the list on the wall. I could see the E barely, but I memorized what the kid in front of me said because I was too embarrassed to tell anybody, and I didn't know that I was so blind. And then I actually had enough problems just seeing from the eye to the glass. So they put hard contact lenses, and I was like, this is a new world. I can see. And now I have intraocular lens implants to actually be able to see normally.
And at high school graduation, I'm going to assume you left the house.
Absolutely.
How did you then plan your schooling? And how did you finance your schooling?
Well, the first thing is that my parents were always in that mindset, you've got to work. So I did a lot of babysitting when I was younger. But once I became a teenager, then I worked in the summers in the Catskill resorts as a waitress and a coffee girl. And I must say that in those days, I made very good tip money because rich New York City people came up to the Catskills. And in the early 70s, I was clearing $200 a week in tips.
Wow.
That was more than my father made. Of course, I didn't tell him. And he had the mindset, you work, that's your money. And I saved every single dime I ever worked at to get into college. And then I was fortunate enough to get a very nice scholarship to Clark University in Massachusetts, which was pre-med, pre-law, and is a unique university. It was private, so it was a bit pricey, but they gave me a very good scholarship, a national defense loan. They gave me work study, which means you work 20 hours a week and you get a little pay. And then I had saved up a significant amount of money to really get in college. And I ended up staying in a flat with 3 other girls that really had hardly any heat in the winter. So in the windows were ice on the inside of the place in Massachusetts. But to this day, 2 of the 3 are still my very good friends, and we've known each other for half a century.
And this will go into your physician, but how then did you come to Nevada?
Well, first I have to say how I got into med school, because that is what led to the prison. Medical school was, of course, outrageously expensive, something that would be impossible for me to finance. And I was squirreling around for anything I could find. And I was incredibly lucky to get the National Health Service Corps Scholarship. And that meant that the federal government would finance your medical school, pay for the medical school, but in return, you owed the feds 4 years of your life. Sort of like being in the military, except I didn't have to kill somebody. And when my time was up, because I finished medical school in Cincinnati.
At what year?
I finished that in 1984 in Cincinnati. And then, of course, you have to do a residency. And the residency, I wanted internal medicine because I like to look at holistic things, the spectrum. And I ended up getting in University of Nevada, Reno, because I wanted to be on the West Coast. I love to ski. And my parents had moved to California in the late 70s when IBM went from the New York IBM world to the Silicon Valley world. And when I experienced the West, I was like, I got to get out of here, especially Cincinnati. That was not really my favorite. So here I am, medical residency. In my 3rd year, I was the chief resident because they couldn't find one. So I had double duty, 3rd year resident and a chief resident. And when I was finished, they said, well, okay, the National Health Corps, the federal government said, we're going to put you in a manpower shortage area. That means a place that no doctors want to work. I thought I'd be shipped to an inner city or rural area. But in those days, I was told, oh, you're going to a male prison in Carson City. And I thought, that's not what I expected. And actually, when I signed the contract, it didn't say anything about prisons. But prisons at that time were considered manpower shortage. They couldn't get doctors. They paid very little compared to the outside world, like 25% salary compared to the outside world. And they also were very violent times in prisons. And it's a sort of ugly area to work in if you're used to people being nice to you or having nice surroundings.
Let me take you back, because you would have been one of the earlier folks that attended the UNR med school. How did you find that?
They had problems, I will say, at that time. They had, I had some very good professors, but they had a hard time with, let's say, getting a true, what's the word? Maybe the director at that time in charge of the residents. So this is just what occurs to my mind. In my third year, they couldn't get a chief resident. Okay, that's not a good sign. So then they made me chief, and actually Dennis Luther, who was a black, male. And so we did half and half because they couldn't find a chief resident. Then the person in charge of the residency at that time was a doctor who had done some research on digitalis, digoxin, and he didn't know how to really run a residency, and nor was he really the type of physician to demonstrate how you took care of patients. He was more of a researcher. And so it was a little rocky. But I had some excellent professors, Dr. Stephen Zell, Dr. Frank McIntosh, and those guys were oncologists. And I mention them because when I ended up in the prison, and I ended up doing all sorts of medical things in the prison, I ended up doing the chemotherapy for the cancer patients for the entire state, for the prison system. And I'll never forget, I had this really poor guy with lots of cancer, and I called up Dr. Zell, and I said, man, what should I really do? He goes, oh, Karen, you should do this. You should do intrathecal bleomycin. That means like do a spinal tap and put chemo drugs in it. And I ended up becoming part of the Carson Tahoe City's hospital, the Carson Hospital. And I sat on their tumor board all those years. So I had the ability to interact with the oncologist, Dr. Kelly, and sit on the tumor board so I could present my cases. And then I'd have all these specialists, radiation, the surgeons, the oncologists, and we would talk about what's the regimen I'm going to give in the prison system. Plus, I had an unbelievable luck that one of my nurses that started out with me, Pamela Johnson, she was a very, very good chemo nurse. That means knew how to deal with ports, knew how to deal with the chemo drugs, and she and I really were the pioneers in doing cancer treatment inside the prison, which saved the state untold money because, one, they didn't have to bring the inmate to the hospital where you need 2 officers or maybe 3 officers sitting around the clock for days in a hospital setting, because that costs a lot of money, plus the transport, the security issues.
How many inmates were there when you first
when I started?
And by the time you left?
Right.
That needed that cancer therapy?
Well, we always had cancer patients because the prison system, in terms of its ultimate population, one thing people don't realize is in the 1970s, once we hit sort of the mid to late 70s, our prison population in the United States, as well as Nevada, increased 4 to 5-fold compared to any other industrialized countries in the world. And that was known as the mass incarceration arena. That had to do with laws changing, minimum mandatory sentences, very, very long sentences, the war on drugs, so individuals who had drugs were thrown into prisons for years and then got into trouble and then stayed longer. And so I was, if you look at a graph, I was on that graph where the asymptote just goes straight up from the late 70s to about 2000 or so. And then it starts leveling off. But my prison, Northern Nevada Correctional Center, which is in Carson City, outside Carson a bit, that had about 1,500 inmates. The camp, minimum security camp next to me, Stewart Conservation Camp, had about 350. And then Nevada State Prison, which was decommissioned in 2012, but I also took care of, had about 900 at its max. And so all those individuals who were sick were funneled to me. And in the early 90s, I started in 1987. And in the early 1990s, they built the first regional medical facility in prison in the state of Nevada. And it sits at Northern Nevada Correctional Center. It has 60 medical beds on the bottom, 60 psych beds on the top. So it's a 120-bed hospital that I also took care of. And we ultimately had a dialysis unit, like 5 dialysis units in that regional medical facility.
And this has continued?
And this has continued. I left in 2016, about 30 years after my 30-year career. And I would have stayed longer, but that particular time period, let's just say for me, medically, the administration turned to the dark side. And they had a warden there who actually took away my keys to get into my own infirmary, claiming it was a security issue. Mind you, that was never in 30 years. And then it's very complicated to explain, but if you don't have a key to get into your own infirmary, and this is in the back where the sick guys are, you have to wait for an officer. But that officer has to go with the nurses whenever they give out drugs, whenever they give an injection, because that's the security. So I'm stuck not being able to get into my infirmary. I complained. I complained about a lot of things when they started changing our schedules, our security parameters. So it made it so hard that I couldn't really practice medicine. And I filed a complaint with HR. Then the HR lady sent it to the prison director, and he ended up throwing it out and firing her. And I knew I'm not going to win this one, and I've done my 30 years, so I would have to pivot and do something different when I left.
So prison directors generally change.
Every 3 years or
about
so.
Every 3 or 4 years.
Right, true.
Was this just one period in your life, or did this continually be a problem?
It was a persistent problem for me from a medical side, because some prison directors are more progressive in terms of being open and doing things. That's me. And then you have other prison directors that don't believe anything the inmates say. If their lips are moving, they're lying. Lock them down. Right. Step on their necks, and heaven forbid, why would you want to give them any programs or education? So you go from the light to the dark, and I was swinging back and forth for years, but then it got a little bit too dark for me.
Then there was also a period that you were there, I believe, about the start of AIDS.
Oh, absolutely.
So give us a little information about how you, as a prison doctor, navigated the AIDS trail.
Yeah, the AIDS trail was wild, because when I started in 1987, in July, there was no drug at all available to do anything. AZT didn't come out until the fall of 87.
And we're talking AIDS just about the early 80s?
Yeah, the early 80s, it was about 1981 where they started calling things GRID and then AIDS. And I was in medical school in Cincinnati, and I had a bit of a scare in that here I am, a medical student, and in 1981, I'm on the wards, and they're like, oh, this guy's from San Francisco. He's dying of that, GRID stuff. And he was dying of everything. He was an absolute AIDS case. And then they freaked out, and they're like, okay, you're the medical students. You go in like dressed up in almost like a spacesuit to get blood. And all right. So, and I'm looking at this poor guy, and you're a student. You're not very good at drawing blood anyway. So I draw his blood, and then I'm nervous about everything. And I tried to inject it into the tube, the stopper. I injected it into my palm. Okay. And my first thought was, not that I was going to die, but that, oh my God, I don't want anybody to know, right? Because what would happen to me, I'd be probably put into like some sort of cage or something in those days. And knock on wood, I never got HIV from that needle stick. But there were, of course, medical people who did get HIV. But when I ended up in the prison, I had already taken care of AIDS patients at Washa back in the day. And I also was very fortunate that my professor, Dr. Stephen Zell, was very big into the state AIDS task force. And what happened is, and most people don't know this, in Nevada, somehow the legislature in 1985 said, we want to test every single inmate in the state for HIV. 1985, they did that. Okay. Now, I don't know why that happened, unless maybe there was some homophobic legislators, or I don't know, because what were they going to do? There was no treatment, but they wanted to know. And so they found out, like, we have about, and it was probably about 1 out of maybe 50 or 60 men at that time who had HIV. The women were even higher. Now, we only had a very small amount of women, but the women were higher because they were predominantly prostitutes and drug addicts and, ones who are very high at risk for also getting HIV. And when I came in, I realized they also had the rule when they entered a prison, you do basic blood test. So they were doing syphilis, TB, and then HIV. And I saw my first, HIV inmate, and I'm like, what's going on here? And then I found out this was the prison's rule. Every intake has an HIV test. And then I found out that they had a whole list of HIV guys that they had picked up, but nobody did anything with that information because they didn't have any really medical system, right? They're told, do this, they do it, and then they don't do anything. So I became very big in HIV in the early days in the prison world. One, we're the only state in the country that had that type of data to share with the rest of the country. And I ended up speaking at drug company, things, because the first time a drug company approached me with AZT, and he said, oh, we're getting a big speaker out of San Francisco and Reno. We're going to give a talk. You want to go? I go, yes, I want to learn what's going on. And I said, how do I become a speaker? I was kidding. And they go, really? And all of a sudden, they pull me in because they find that I have this information that nobody has, like how much HIV is really in the prison population. If you look at the huge places like Florida and Texas, Florida especially, they had a lot of AIDS patients, and for many, many years, even when they had effective drugs, they did not give any treatment to those inmates at all. And they ended up with huge class action suits. We never did that in Nevada because when the drugs came out, I was giving medications to the men who I felt would, who needed it. Of course, there were always occasionally guys who 100% refused the drugs until they got really, really sick and then changed their mind. So we saved a lot of the HIV and AIDS cases. I ended up doing in-service training for the custody officers because they were scared for blood-borne pathogens. I ended up creating the HIV support groups inside the prison. And then ultimately, we got involved with the Hopes Clinic in Reno, and that's much later in the time course. And I ended up I even have some toys with me, but one's a cute little, trophy, I will call it, where I got the Heroes for Humanity Award from the state of Nevada for my care in HIV in the prison.
So you were sort of the leading voice in the state? Or?
In the state for the correctional world, for the prison world. And in fact, the first prison director told me, okay, we're going down to Las Vegas. There's a big state meeting. You have to go with me. And so we were involved with the state task force. And since my professor was on the state task force, I ended up on the state task force. And Trudy Larson, who also I knew through UNR, was an exceptional doctor, and she was an expert in pediatric HIV. And so the three of us knew each other through the UNR program, and we were the leaders in HIV in those days, the late 80s, 90s.
So let me kind of take you back because you're mentioning these folks. So as a UNR or University of Nevada,
Correct.
I think at that time, med student, you were associated with Washoe Medical at
Washoe.
that time.
Yes.
I don't think it was Renown.
No, it was
and
Washoe.
St. Mary's.
No, it was really all Washoe.
All Washoe.
And then, of course, they had the indigent clinic with Washoe as well. That was part of us. And the VA hospital. We took care of the Veterans Hospital.
So you did have a variety of
Right.
of experts that you could
Yes.
call on.
Yes.
Well, that's really interesting. You must have felt like a fish out of water when you first came to the prison, because I understand that there wasn't a lot of direction.
No, there wasn't any direction. It was so bizarre. There was a Dr. Browning who interviewed me initially. And I thought, oh, good, this guy actually is a doctor and he seems normal, and I'll have somebody who can help me with the ropes, basically. When I enter, it was ridiculous. I showed up at the gatehouse. They didn't even know I was coming. And it turned out that the medical director had taken a vacation, and I had no idea that he took a break, ended up collapsing his cervical vertebrae from metastatic cancer, and nobody told me that this had happened. So I come in, I'm totally with no direction whatsoever. No one tells me what to do, where to go, and I go in, and they're like, there's the infirmary over that way. And this is the old days where you have to go all through the gates and get into this old building. And the nurse there also is not really pleasant to me. And she was handing out her pills, and she goes, that guy over there will show you around. And here's a guy in scrubs. She didn't tell me he was an inmate. It was very wild. And so this guy's showing me all around, and I'm asking all sorts of questions. I have no idea he's an inmate, because I assume if someone's in scrubs, this is like the medical world. And then when I come back, there's this very large physician assistant who was one of those Vietnam med techs, and he's a physician assistant, big, big guy. And he sees me walking with the guy in scrubs, the inmate, and he goes, "What the hell are you doing with that chomo?" And I think, I don't even, like, one, I don't know why he's yelling at me. And two, I didn't even know what a chomo was. And in the prison vernacular, that means child molester. And it was just extremely highly unprofessional. And it very much seemed that many people didn't like me right from the get-go. And I can assume that it's a very male-dominated world, totally male-dominated. And then you have all the male inmates. And then the director of nursing was the wife of the associate warden of operations. So they have tremendous nepotism as well. And I was just incredibly naive. I always expected they would like a doctor or want a doctor, but they looked at me as an enemy. And I think one, because I was female. The other was they have this issue with women that if it's an attractive female, then they're going to be compromised. And actually, in the real prison world, that's not true. Because if you have a female who is not attractive at all, and then they get attention from the male inmates, they are far more at greater risk than a female who doesn't care because they have a whole different world than the outside. And I was married, and I had married just a few months before I got placed in the prison. And my husband was 6'2", black male, very good looking, highly intelligent, was a platoon leader in Vietnam. But when the good old boys found out I was married to a black male, that was just, I think, blew their mind. Because in Carson City in the 80s, yeah, there were like no black people there except in prison. And then it was like 1 out of 3, right? So there were a number of what I would consider racists in the system who had issues with me as well. And in fact, I was investigated by the associate warden of operations. And that investigation, I just heard like, oh, you're being investigated, they want to throw you out, they want to take your medical license away. And I was very afraid. And I talked to my husband, and he goes, go right to the top, just go right to the prison director. And then the prison director told me, hey, I want to show you this. And then he handed me a huge stack of paperwork. He goes, this is the investigation on you. I want you to read it all so you know who your enemies are, so you can get your enemies. And I'm like, what kind of world is this? And that's how my life started in the prison.
So a little bit of racism and sexism both.
Correct. That's how I felt.
So what would you think would be your greatest contribution that you made in the prison community?
I would say that my greatest contribution for the inmate population was that I truly cared about them, and that I also did not judge them. I was always the curious scientific type. I did not look at pedophiles or murderers or serial killers and immediately judge them and then oriented to punish them. I was oriented to try to understand and try to heal what I could. And I wanted the inmates to be better than they had come in, because a lot of them, 95%, are going to ultimately leave someday. And I wanted them to be an asset to society, not a liability.
And that's a pretty positive attitude. Did you have mentors or anyone that helped you gain this attitude, or anyone along the way that gave you credence to how you were going to ultimately, whether it was the prison or or another situation react?
Yeah, I was thinking about mentors. My family stayed away from interacting with people. So that was very insular. And thankfully, I had some good teachers. And there's some that really made an impression on me, but one that I'll mention was Mrs. Daly, who was teaching psychology when I was in high school. And one of the things she did was she came to me and she goes, "Okay, Karen, you jumped some grades here. You need to do something else." Because I sort of ran out of courses for the high school because they made me jump. And she said, "Look, we've got a unique case. We've got a girl from New York City who is going to be in 7th grade. And our high school system went from 7th grade to 12th grade. And she said, this girl, she spent a lot of time in the hospital with heart problems. She's not stupid, but she really doesn't know how to read or write or do plain math. And there's no way 7th grade teachers are going to be able to bring her up to speed." She goes, "Okay, your 1-year project is to get this 7th grader the ability to read, write, and have basic math skills." And so they bring this little girl to me, and she's black, which is in upstate New York also hardly ever see. I had 2 black girls in my class of 400, right? So very little. And so this little girl truly had major heart surgeries and spent all her time in the hospital, and nobody ever taught her anything. And so we started off, and the funny thing was she was very attractive, like a little 7th grader, but really she was a beauty. And she was telling me all about her boyfriend. And I'm thinking, okay, here I am. I'm close to a senior. I don't have a boyfriend. But this little girl did in New York City. And she said, "Karen, read me. He's writing me letters." And I said, "Well, okay, but you're going to learn how to read." And so that's what was the door for me to open her up, to help her learn how to read, mainly because she wanted to read her boyfriend's letters, right? And then she was very into buying things for herself, and that's how I really got her to understand math. So in a year, she was really close to up to speed, but with the 8th graders. And that allowed me, and also sort of opened the door, like, people need a chance. Because if Mrs. Daly hadn't made my year to get this 7th grader up to speed, she would have been ostracized and, labeled stupid and been upset with herself and everything else. So that was a big deal for me.
And kind of opened your eyes to...
that some people don't have the opportunity because of all sorts of circumstances. And in an odd way, some of the inmates reminded me of that, where when you really look at their background in terms of sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and all the things that would happen to them, it's a wonder they didn't turn out worse. And then you give them care and you do things for them. I created a lot of programs in the prison as a volunteer, a lot of them. And they started out as courses to help with addiction. And then I realized, no, that's not the big thing. It's life skills. It's their poor life skills that causes them to float into the addiction world because they can't cope with life skills. And that I did that in the camp and on the prison yard. So I volunteered a lot of time. I also started a program called the Gavel Club, which was Toastmasters, the ability for them to speak in front of a group of guys was the most entertaining thing I've seen in a long time, because you would have like a humongous muscly guy, right, who could just pound any little guy down to the ground, and he'd be up there sweating and try to say something, and the little skinny guy's like, "You can do it, Joe, you can do it, Joe." And they really helped each other, and it was such a unique experience to see And that was every other Sunday night. And I would bring my husband in to teach. One of the reasons I survived the prison is because my husband really helped me with the inmate population. In my second year, the black community in the prison came to me and said, hey, we're supposed to have a speaker for Martin Luther King Day. And the NAACP said they'd cough up a speaker, but they canceled at the last minute. It's all set up, but we don't have a speaker. And they go, we hear your husband's black. Can he come in and speak? So I have to go home and tell my husband, hey, Clifton, could you speak in the prison? And he was like, why me? I'm a finance guy. I said, yes, but you're black, so you got to go. And that really went well in the gym with all these black guys, and there were only 2 white guys up front, a Spanish guy and a guy from France, and all the rest were blacks. But then the black guys came to Clifton and said, hey, Mr. Macklin, because his name's Macklin, Mr. Macklin, could you teach black history in the college course? And my husband goes, you know, I'm not only black, I'm Scottish and Cherokee, because he's a mutt mix. My husband preferred to be called a hybrid mix, but he was a mutt mix. And he ended up saying, no, I want to teach ethnic history of the United States. And first of all, it was all blacks. And then, of course, it became a course for guys who were just interested in history. Wow. And he ended up teaching in many classes, and he really taught finance and accounting. And some guys, there's one of his students who's now a CFO of a company out there in the outside world. He had a lot of guys who he was able, since he wasn't technically a prison employee, he worked through Western Nevada Community College as a professor. He was able to help them get jobs. And then he knew who was going to be the good ones and the bad ones for, you know, doing well in jobs.
Have potential.
Right. And so he has had a lot of successes with certain guys.
So you seem to strive at challenges. What makes you tick? What's your motivational source? I
think that if I see something where I can improve on it, it's always more common sense to me than anything else. And I think also I really have an issue with bullies. And I also believe very much in the human potential if you water it and nourish it. And also to heal people so they can do the types of things that, let's say, make them blossom. You know, I don't do it just because I want to be like a fighter or something. In fact, that's not me. I want to be sneaky and get things done. I don't want to be attacked all the time.
So, obviously from your high school experience, but were you always driven like this?
I think so. I think because since I was the oldest, I have one sister. She was 1 year younger. But if you ever see of our photos together, my mother made me 100% responsible for my sister, who was 1 year younger. So if she did stupid things, we both got severely beaten. And my sister did a lot of stupid things. Like, oh, let's carve this. And she'd chop her finger, and then it'd be my fault. Or she'd want to play with the ropes and throw over the wash line and put her foot in and yank on it and turn upside down and land on her head, right? So all these things were my fault. So I was always responsible. I think it was that responsibility.
So, and I know you've done a lot of things afterwards that I'll ask you about, but what do you think your most significant contribution has been in your life up to this point? You're in not over the
right.
year, but you're in your retirement years.
Well, I think my greatest contribution was what I consider prison reform. And that has to do with all the different tentacles that I spread out. And when I retired, I'm still in that world, the prison reform world, and just in a totally different way. And this is also why I wrote my book, 30 Years Behind Bars, because I wanted to have the outside world to see the view of a prison system and world that's usually hidden from view through the eyes of someone oriented who is a healer, not an inmate and not the people, that are in charge of the custody, but the one who wanted to heal this.
And how has that expanded after your retirement years into the prison systems?
The way it expanded is that, one, I've been able to talk about my book at different meetings and book clubs and make people aware. I belong to a number of different prison reform groups. As an example, when I first retired, I was on the board for the Ridge House. Do you know the Ridge House?
I do.
And the Ridge House is something that years ago, Kairos, which is a religious group, were helping the inmates try to transition from the prison to the outside world. And the initial Kairos group, they looked at religion as a gateway. I am not religious, but anything that can help, I'm not going to be against. And Kairos, when it first started, thought, we have to get some of these guys some help. So, maybe they could just sleep on our couch. They realized, okay, that's not going to work so well. And then they ended up buying homes and then having these little groups. And they had then developed a substance abuse sort of facility to help them. And then Grace Church funded some money for some homes. And these residential homes, they'd have a manager and 4 to 6 guys living there and then trying to get them jobs. And I did that. I sat on that board for a while. And then they had some financial troubles and this and that. And I sort of got off the board. But I still definitely want to promote that those types of programs work. I am a member of the Nevada Prison Education Project, and that is formed by teachers and people who have taught in the prison and the universities. UNR is one, UNLV, WNCC, the different colleges are involved. And I'm a big promoter of education in the prison. In fact, in the spring, I was teaching Psychology 101 as a WNC professor inside the prison. And I am also a facilitator for AVP, that's Alternative Violence Project. And those are people that are volunteers that go into prison systems to help reducing violence, but it's all through like a 3-day program, 8 hours a day of experiential interactions and learning. And I was very impressed with that, how the effect it had on the inmate population. And in fact, interestingly, OJ, at Lovelock Prison, basically...
You're speaking O.J. Simpson.
O.J. Simpson at Lovelock Prison basically came out with like a press release that he said of all the programs he ever took, that was the one that was the most effective for him. So AVP put that on their website, you can imagine. But I really see that where individuals are able to be vulnerable. I also am a member of Return Strong. That's an organization that Jody Hawking, she's a union organizer, and she is very much for the families of the incarcerated, but they push policy at the legislature, trying to make it aware of things that when Vegas was frying, under 120-degree heat with no air conditioning, this is a real problem. And when you have individuals on psychiatric medicines, which cause reduction in sweat, people can die in those type of environments. And so I intermittently will speak at the legislature for the policy world. Then we have Reconnect 180, and that is a new nonprofit who I'll be definitely supporting, and it's all about helping integrating inmates when they leave and helping them with support. And one of those individuals who runs it, Joaquin Webb, he was my clerk in the prison for years. He did 20 years, but he has made many inroads with a lot of powerful people, including prison director, the sheriff, parole, P&P, and everyone else, because they need truly a reentry program that will work. And I am also starting, and maybe it shall be launched in late October, a podcast, because I was approached by some movie people about my book. And not that it'll go anywhere, but they were telling me, hey, do you realize one of the series, Landsman, with Billy Bob Thornton and Mark Colley and those guys, they said that it all started from a 10-episode podcast where a Texas author was talking about Boomtown. And they said, you've got great stories, and how about you do a podcast? And I never thought about doing a podcast, but I like to take on challenges. I think I have that thing in me where I don't want to sit around. And so it's going to be called Prison Unlocked. And I have already done, I think, about 6 interviews, and I'm putting together 10 before I launch it. But I've got everything from the prison director, like Glenn Wharton, who was prison director. He was a warden at Nevada State Prison, and he's the historian for the Nevada State Prison historical tours. Now I'm a tour guide too. And tonight I have to go and help with the pre-event for the Mustang. They're going to do the Unlocked Cinema, so I'm also a prison tour guide, which is sort of fun to learn about the history of Nevada State Prison. And Patty, if no one knows, Patty lived in the warden's house at Nevada State Prison when she was a kid. So it's a unique small world.
You've had an interesting life, and of course, you've got a long way to go. But at this point, how would you like to be remembered?
I think I only want to be remembered for making an impact with the prison reform arena. I don't have children. My husband and I mentored 5 kids through Big Brother, Big Sister program, though my husband was really the greatest impact because he was not working. I worked a lot of hours, so I only could play fairy godmother, not a true full-time Big Brother, Big Sister type. And those 5 kids are still doing well, and they came from families where the majority of them had fathers that were in prisons. And I must say, I don't really care. Once I'm dead, I'm dead. I don't care. I really don't care. Like some people, I don't know, they have whatever. The whole eulogy and funerals and that's not my thing. If I'm gone, so what? I'm gone.
So, who do you see carrying on what you have done? Have you mentored folks that will take your position in the prison?
Well, I have actually a number of inmates who went through a lot of my programs. For example, the Toastmaster group. I have a individual who is doing very well in California, and he and his wife are great supporters of the Defy organization. And Defy is helping ex-inmates with entrepreneurial skills, and it's all through California and Washington. They'd love to bring it to Nevada as well. And, he was one of my children who really did well.
So here you are. You have seen young people, both women and men, come into the fields of penology as well as just simply getting a vocation, what would you say to them?
Well, what I would say to them, looking back at my life, is that I look at something called what I make up the 3 C's. One is you always have to stay curious to try to understand things, why you act like you act, why other people act as they do, curious about where we're going in this country, in this world, with what's happening. And the second C is compassion, and that is truly understanding and empathizing with the people around you, but also to try to decrease their suffering. And the third, which I did not do so well because of my upbringing, was collaboration, where you have to collaborate with others to really make a significant impact on wherever you're going. I was one of those people where I was trained, never ask for help, never bother anyone. And I realized I could have been a little bit easier in my life if I actually collaborated with people. And that was probably one of my weaknesses.
So what would you have said to yourself at 18 with the experiences that you have now, 18 or 20?
Well, I would have told myself, okay, Karen, you grew up with a mother who had ungodly fears about strangers, about in any way being beholden to anything. And I'll tell you that I had some real quirks because I was so trained not to ask. When I married my husband at 30, and he'd go, roll down the window and ask that guy for directions, I couldn't do it. That's how bad it was, right? I didn't want to bother him. He goes, what's the matter with you? Just ask him. I can't. And then I realized I was a bit too programmed. And my husband got that out of me after a while. But and the thing is, you have to realize that you are impacted very much by your upbringing. And if you're ever interested, you should look at what's called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, ACE study, that came out of Kaiser Permanente and the CDC back in the 90s. And it had 10 parameters like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and, drugs in families, incarcerated. And if you realize if you've got a lot of strikes against you, you are at risk, and you really need to work on those risk factors.
Well, this has been really interesting. What have I not asked that you think is important?
I think the one thing you forgot to ask, and which is what people ask me when they read my book, they will ask, hey, Karen, in your second year in your career, you were taken hostage, you were assaulted, you were raped, you were concussion grenaded on Friday the 13th, and on Monday you went back to work. And not only did you go back to work, you stayed another 28 years. How and why did you ever do that? And there are a lot of people, I think, who would have tried to figure out how to get out of the prison. But for me, I was in my second year of a 4-year payment, right, to the government. And also, I was raised to never give up. I think that's the other thing. Whatever happens to you, so what? My mother was like, so what, you fell out of a tree and you got lots of broken bones, just go to school. I mean, there was no empathy there. It's just like, you just do what you do. And I would say, though, what really helped me process everything was about 2 days after the hostage event. Like, I go back to the prison, and custody doesn't say anything to me. They ignore me. Don't say anything. And the inmates, when they interacted with me, are you okay, Dr. Gedney? They cared. And they sent me actually get well cards. And they they showed that they cared. And the prison, that I'm not sure why, because I was too alien for the custody world, or that they were afraid they were going to be sued, like held responsible. Because in those days, they did not don't really have any security for me. I mean, Kenneth Meller, who was the hostage taker, he came in with a buck knife, homemade ropes that he'd made out of T-shirts, a carton of cigarettes, Junior mints, and acid. He brought like the supplies with him for this hostage situation, right? And nobody checked, inmates coming into the infirmary to see the doctor, right? And that's a very stupid security breach. You don't let people come in with armament, right, into a medical facility in a prison, and so.
And the reason you continued?
The reason I continued is one, the care from the inmates, but the other big thing was that about 2 days later after the event, I got a call that came in through the phone, and it was the inmate's mother. Now, they had killed him, Kenneth Meller, the inmate. And the mother was like, "Oh, Dr. Gedney, I'm so sorry Kenny, did this to you." And in the paper, I didn't talk to reporters at all. So all what it said was, "Gedney hostage, back on work on Monday," right? So this poor old lady calls me up and says, "I'm so sorry my son did that. And I'm glad nothing happened to you." Okay, so this is bad. When that happened, when she said that, I said, "Well, nothing except your son assaulted, raped me, da-da-da-da," right? And then this poor old lady starts crying. And it was like, hearing her crying was like being kicked in the gut, where it was, why did I say that to this poor old lady? I'm hurting her. I shouldn't have said that. And I realized I was teaching the inmates all the time, if you're hurt, that doesn't mean you hurt somebody else. And here, this just came out from me. So it was a wake-up call for me that I had to get over the hurt. And two, I had to absolutely forgive the inmate. And also, it was harder for me to forgive custody because they constantly gave me problems. But to forgive both so I could actually keep on going.
And that's
really what helped me be able to stay for 30 years. And it's sort of like, why should one bad thing derail me from actually being able to help people?
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights.
And thank you for interviewing me. So this is the card I got after the hostage situation. Kenneth Meller, who took me hostage, was a lifer. That means no possibility to parole. So every single lifer on the prison yard signed the card for me, saying this is not us and we don't condone what he did. So that was pretty wild to get this. And then one of the inmates also ended up writing a beautiful article that went to the newspaper. And the newspaper article was him saying, "Hey, this inmate, Kenneth Meller, he should have never, done this, and we in no way condone what goes on." But it was really extremely well written. Now, the other sorts of things, I have floating around here. So imagine my husband died in 2019, and the inmates sent this to my home. And
they made the cover?
Yeah, they made everything.
Oh, show it to first.
All right, so they made everything. And all these inmates who knew my husband and got teaching from him all wrote beautiful stuff. But that's them. They're like They're a very different type of group. Because you can imagine, and then I have so many of these, they would do certificates. The Blue Eagles Gavel Club, that's the Toastmasters. Oops, the Blue Eagles Gavels Club, they would give me certificates. And my husband came every other Sunday, so they gave him certificates. Yeah, it's sort of funny. And
You have a picture, I believe, of your husband.
Yeah, I do have a picture of my husband.
Do you have a picture of your family?
I got different pictures of my family. They're sort of small, but this gives you an idea. Here's my mother and my sister and I.
Wow.
In the Catskills. And so the inmates, would give me things, but this was pretty wild because I also taught in the camp. So here is the National Division of Forestry.
Just a little lower.
The National Division of Forestry, where the inmates, fight the forest fires and they're chopping down trees and everything. So here they chop down this, whatever wood thing, and they is an appreciation of, Dr. Gedney for caring and direction and gratitude from your inmates at Stewart Conservation Camp. They would do these types of things, and you have no idea how many of the weird things I get from them. And this is the first group on the prison yard that I taught with the life skills courses. So they included a picture of all of them on it. And it's also for your selfless, what does it say? Selfless devotion to the Beta program. That's Bureau of Alcohol and Drug Abuse program, which later was changed to HRR. But there they are, my guys. And I would say the guys who worked for me have really statistically done extremely well, because they were the ones who wanted to, be of service in the prison. And here's something funny. So here's a picture of me and my husband, Clifton. This is at Governor Miller's inauguration, okay? And so imagine, poor Clifton's the only black person there, okay? And so he comes up with me, and the governor's wife, she had heard I'd been hostage, so she was sort of curious. She came over to talk to me, and, Clifton's standing next to me, and then her security guards come up to him and tap him on the shoulder and say, your set is starting, because they had a black entertainment group. And I told my husband, Cliff, go up there and sing, okay? And the funny thing is, because my husband played and wrote music and was a very good guitarist, he also had a great voice. Clifton won I didn't know this, my sister found some old Chicago newspaper or something because she was snooping out my husband. And at 12 years old, he won a national singing contest, in the United States, right? And I asked Cliff, how come you never told me you won a national singing contest? He goes, that was when I was a kid. And then, so I found out lots of stuff. My husband's mother was an international pianist and played at Carnegie Hall.
Wow.
Okay. My husband grew up in a very elite family. And then his father, who was
From Chicago?
In Chicago, yeah. He lived in Hyde Park, right?
Ah.
And his father was a real estate tycoon. But then his father leveraged too many apartment buildings out and this and that. And his father's fortune fell when Clifton was 17. So he went from being an ultra-rich kid going to the Jewish schools, and, he knew Saul Alinsky, all the union organizers and everything. And he would tell me his mother had soirees in the house with Milton Friedman, Malcolm X, Jackie Robinson. I'm like, this is like a history lesson for me. I'm like at a country thing where we get nothing, we're just eating off the land, and he was here and I was there.